Hey friends, welcome to Weekly Chapel. Reverend Davis here. I'm excited this week to have my friend Mr. Ryan Mijumbi with us. Ryan is the president of Interfaith United, VP of Pride Club, active member in Catholic Campus Ministry, former All-Star in Residence Life. He does everything at High Point University. We've been leading up this summer talking about these power of stories. And Ryan and I have been talking for a while about the complex, maddening, wonderful story that is Job in the Hebrew Bible. And we're going to key in on really like three things this evening, which is Ryan's going to retell the story briefly to us, though it really is one to be read over a lifetime. Then we're going to get into two things within the story itself, which are the story that we're telling ourselves about God all the time and how that shapes our lives and how it shapes our values. And the second is about this relationship, this kind of can't quit you kind of relationship between God and Job, which is like between God and us, or God and God's people. So, Ryan, hey, glad to have you here, man.
It's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Do you want to say something about the plot structure of this story?
I'm sure. So once upon a time in the land of Uz, we have Job who has wife, kids, livestock, land. He's like very wealthy and very blessed. And up in heaven, the accuser comes to God and goes like, God, does your servant Job serve you for nothing? So God and the accuser have a wager that if Job loses everything, his family, his livestock, his land, his servants, that he will reject God and blame him for his suffering. And yet, despite everything, Job still stands for God. Even when his wife tells him to curse God and die, he is like, I will accept both adversity and good from God. And through his trials, especially the trials with his friends who come and comfort him at first, but then begin to question him, eventually God comes into the picture and explains to Job, where were you when I formed the cosmos and created all that you see? Where were you at the end and where were you at the beginning? And it puts Job into perspective about his place in the universe. And upon seeing Job's piety, God rewards him back a family, his livestock, twofold in fact, and Job lives happily ever after. But for me personally, I find the interesting part of Job to be the dialogues he has with his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. When Job literally has nothing and his skin is boiling, he's just sitting there naked, his friends come and just sit with him for 7 days in silence. Upon the abject horror that Job had gone through, his friends come into the picture and sit with him.
We can start right there. And you want or keep going? You want to keep going? What do his friends do?
Then after this heartfelt moment, his friends, upon hearing what Job has been going through lately, begin to essentially interrogate him. For example, in chapter 4 of Job, Eliphaz questions Job by saying, remember now, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright destroyed? According to what I have seen, those who plow wrongdoing and those who sow trouble harvest it. By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they come to an end. Bildad comes along and also says, does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert what is right? And even Zophar comes along and says, can you discover the depths of God? Can you discover the limits of the Almighty? And even ends with, for he knows false people and he sees injustices without investigating. So his friends are coming at Job with what I would like to call a meritocratic type of theology. This idea that if you are a good person and you do righteous things, then good will happen to you, then God will bless you. But if you are an evil person, if you are wicked and you sow deceit and hatred into the world, then God will rightly punish you. However, Job presents an interesting contradiction to this theology, because as shown before, Job never blamed God. He never cursed God's name. In fact, in chapter 3, Job is even asking God to blot out the day of his birth and to forget about him. So, despite everything that his friends tell him for like the next 30 chapters, Job pleads innocence because he is, in fact, innocent.
Let's dive into this meritocratic theology, because I think that's operating in most of us all the time, undiscovered. But first, I like that you lifted up kind of the pros and cons of the friendship of these three characters. The first thing they do with unjust suffering, which is what most people think Job is about and what we're talking about right now, the first thing they do is sit with him for 7 days in silence. And there's something actually just incredibly beautiful about that, about the texture of the friendship. Because most of it, I think what the three characters, these three friends, get berated for often are they're attacking him. But the first thing they do is really lovely. It's actually, no, they just sit with their friend in his own suffering and they give him presents. Because I imagine most of us, the last thing we want when we're going through suffering are cheap answers. We don't want answers, we want presents.
Exactly. And that's why at first, when I read this, I was kind of on Job's side. Why are you attacking me? Why are you trying to make me this evil person when I am not? I'm just a suffering servant before God. But looking into it more, I'm starting to see that his friends, their entire theology is being confronted by the grim reality of suffering in our world, unjust suffering to be exact. And they are trying to comfort Job in the way that they know how by giving him an answer, some semblance of like, well, we know God to be this, so he must be like that, correct? And it kind of digs into this idea of theology. I know that with our series, it's about the power of story and how narratives transform our lives. And I want to put something out there that this idea of theology, theos meaning God, logos meaning word. Perhaps theology is the stories we tell ourselves about God, and that Job's friends have a story of God, but Job's experience falls out of that story, and that is why it feels like they're attacking him, because they're trying to rectify their own story of God with Job's lived experience.
Nice. Now, I think this may sound high and lofty to some people who are listening, or maybe other students right now, but the fact of the matter is, I think, is being a pastor of working with college students now for almost a decade, is we actually always are telling ourselves a story about who God is, or even take the word God out and put in most important. We're always telling ourselves about what is most important in our lives and those things that we worship. But when it comes into Christian community in particular, yeah, I think we are often telling ourselves a story about who God is, and we have trouble with the exceptions to the rule. Or we do want to create a God that blesses the good and destroys the wicked. And that's in Scripture. It's in Scripture. It's true. It just may not be complete. Because what do you do with unjust suffering? What do you do with any of us, and seeing this recently with pain that is rendered upon the innocent? I think when I come back to this friendship thing with Bildad and Zophar, while at first they sit with him for 7 days, they have no deeper resources to be in relationship and be alongside Job because of who they see God as. They've boxed themselves in, and all they have left is to somewhat victim blame here. Not somewhat, they victim blame. They say, nah, surely this has got to be on you, Job, not God. I actually love the question that El Satan, the accuser, starts with God, which is, does Job worship you for nothing? Which is really an accusation that Job actually worships you for a transactional faith. Job actually worships you, God, to get stuff, to get the riches, to get the wealth, which is the same kind of framework that Zophar and Bildad are working with, which is, no, if you do good, you'll get good. If you do evil, you'll get evil. But Job poses a real confrontation to that because he's innocent and suffering,
And
which has
that's
got to take us down the line somewhere. Yeah.
and that's where the power of theology comes from. This idea that the way that you frame God, the way that you understand God influences your actions, influences your beliefs. Job's friends are working with one way to understand God, and Job's situations confronting him with a different story of God. And the fruits of these stories can either lead to justice, love, and peace, or it can lead to hatred, injustice, and bigotry. That
Yes.
the importance of how we understand the story of God shouldn't come from a monovocal place, but a multivocal place, just like in the scriptures. We don't read, I mean, despite the fact that the Bible is one book, we never read one story and go like, that's who God is. We read multiple
Mhm.
stories. We read the Torah, we read the Gospels, we read the epistles, we read the writings, we read all these things to get a picture of who God is. It may be tedious to put all the puzzle pieces together, but that story from its multivocal lens is rich and complex.
And that God is God and we are not. And that's probably good to have that expanded vocabulary for who God is. It would put you in a much more humble place, maybe in a place that you can only be silent before God, like Job at some point, right? The If it's important to the story that we're telling who God is, I think this is very much in leading with a Christian story when Jesus is saying who God is, one who suffers along with humanity, not trying to keep the suffering at a distance to keep some sort of um, intellectual assent of who God is. No, like Jesus's very story is the most holy of stories because it's the most loving of stories in ways because Jesus is in the suffering with humanity. It's saying, no, this is what actually is probably the infinite vision of who God is. A love that isn't keeping the suffering at bay, but immersing oneself into it. For me, that's really important because if that's the story of who we're telling God is, I would find it to make us more courageous. I would find it to make us, if we're worshiping that, we want to become more like that, not to put the suffering at a distance, or but to be in it with those who are going through it.
That
The
is
the other
what
thing, go ahead, Ryan.
sorry. that that last part is one of the reasons why I really like Job. It doesn't try to ignore suffering. It doesn't try to say that it doesn't exist or that it's not some or that it's something that if you just pull yourself up by the bootstraps that you'll overcome. It's suffering is a part. It's that I know that's hard to hear. It's very hard to hear, and depending on the type of suffering that people go through, it may be the wrong thing to hear, and that's where the power of silence comes in because the silence acknowledges the reality and gravity.
Yeah. If we've talked about the importance of the story we're telling who God is, the other thing that the Job story does for me in a profound way, Job never curses God, but he does curse the day of his birth. He says, and this is some of those beautiful Hebrew poetry that we have that's happening in the book of Job. But he says it would have been better for that day to have been blacked out. And um, he asks God to forget him. And this is really powerful to me because it's a paradox. He keeps asking God to forget him, which is to say, he's at once saying, leave me alone, but he can't stop saying to this God, leave me alone, which is to say, he can't quit the relationship with this God, and God can't quit the relationship with him. Which is to say that there's actually some good theology of dissent here. Actually, to be angry with God perhaps at times isn't bad faith, it's good faith. It's continuing the conversation, and what it is revealing is this God can't quit us and we can't quit God. Like our deepest desire is to have a relationship with the source and heart of life. I see that in Job. Like on the surface it's leave me alone so I'll stop being in this position that I am. But at the same time, I can't stop being in relationship with the heartbeat of life. Um, that's what I read in this book of Job that goes beyond just simple questions around suffering. It becomes something about even in our barren places, we desire to be near the source of life, this one we call God, Yahweh, Jehovah, Christ's very presence.
That's beautiful. I really like that a lot.
One more takeaway that you've taken from the story of Job that haunts you or helps you.
I would say one other takeaway I get from Job is more of just the wider context of Job, that throughout the Old Testament, the majority of stories are about a righteous God, his chosen people, and a sacred land that they're either trying to maintain or they're trying to search for. But then we have these stories in Ecclesiastes and Proverbs and Job that kind of take a back seat from that tripart story and dig into the furthering of what it means to know God, what it means to follow that story of God. And I think that's kind of where wisdom comes from. Like, God didn't come with the wind, didn't come with the storm, came with the silence.
Yeah, Elijah. Yeah, sheer silence. Hey, thanks for sharing some of the story with us. I hope other folks will jump into it, because it's one that is wisdom literature and opens you up to a wider way to live in the world. And I think that was the author's intent. So thank you today for joining us, Ryan.
No problem. I really appreciate being a part of this, and I can't wait for this semester to keep having these conversations.
Yeah. God bless you and keep you, and go make your bed. Peace.
Will do.